Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington presents World Focus, a continuing series on international political, social, economic, and cultural issues.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Hillel J. Kival, Chairman of the Jewish Studies Program at the University of Washington. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 1986 Samuel and Althea Stroum Lectures in Jewish Studies. The Jewish Studies Program at the University of Washington, part of the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies, offers a comprehensive program of instruction in Jewish history, religion, thought, language, and literature. In addition to offering an honors major, it mounts a series of courses which attract over 300 students each year. The Samuel and Althea Stroum Lectures in Jewish Studies were established by the Jewish Federation of Greater Seattle in cooperation with the Jackson School to honor the efforts of Samuel and Althea Stroum on behalf of higher Jewish education and the university at large. The lectureship makes it possible to bring to our area outstanding scholars and interpreters of Jewish culture, promoting a deeper understanding of Jewish history, religion, and thought over the centuries and throughout the world. In past years, the lectureship has brought to the university such distinguished individuals as Irving Howe, Yehuda Bauer, Yosef Yerushalmi, Joseph Dahn, and Aharon Appelfeld. The University of Washington Press publishes a series of books based on the Stroum Lectures. Over the past few years, it has issued Yehuda Bauer's Holocaust in Historical Perspective, Yosef Dahn's Jewish Mysticism and Jewish Ethics, and Yosef Yerushalmi's Zachor, Jewish History and Jewish Memory. This last book was awarded the National Jewish Book Award in History, and it recently was the subject of a day-long academic conference held at Boston University. This year's Stroum lecturer is the world-renowned expert on Jewish folklore and ethnology, holder of the Max and Margareta Grunwald Chair in Jewish Folklore at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Professor Dov Noy. Dov Noy hails from Kolomea in Galician Poland, where he was born in 1920. He settled in Israel in 1938. He received his PhD in folklore, anthropology, and comparative literature from Indiana University. Professor Noy is the author of numerous books and articles, among them an index of Talmudic Midrashic literature, folk tales of Israel, Moroccan Jewish folk tales, and, of course, the long and important essay on folklore in the Encyclopedia Judaica. He is currently supervising a project dealing with the folk tales of Ethiopian Jews. He takes up the spatial dimension in his second lecture, Jewish Folklore, East and West. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to present to you Professor Dov Noy.
Dear friends, this is my second lecture in the series, and I shall start just by repeating only the basis, the definitions which became clear at the beginning of my first lecture. I mean the definition of folklore, which is the creative, spiritual, and cultural heritage of the people, of a society, of each society, transmitted from generation to generation, mainly by oral tradition, by oral transmission, and all this is not normative, unlike religion, unlike the law. This is the first point that we should remember. And the second point is, and I'm repeating this again, the different three genres, three kinds of Jewish folklore. Number three was already mentioned here, and this is a formulistic number in all folklore of Europe, Northern Africa, Southwest Asia, from Ireland until to the Urals. Number three is the formulistic basic number in folklore, and therefore scholars in this field tend to divide their kinds, their genres into three. And the same is true here. So according to the ways of transmission, we have audio-oral folklore transmitted by the word of mouth, visual folklore, seen, transmitted by sight, and cogitative folklore, which includes folk beliefs and customs which are created following the folk beliefs. As I said, the transmission takes place in a society on some special occasion, and in order to denotate this occasion, you have to be in some place and in some time, which means that every transmitted item has its place and has its time. The first lecture was devoted to the time. When are these deeds performed? When are the stories told? When are the visual symbols presented? When? And mainly we came to the conclusion that this happens in two cycles: in the life cycle of a person and during the nature cycle, during the year cycle, during the passages from one stage to another stage mainly. Today's lecture will be devoted to the place, or because we have this broad outlook, we shall call it the space. East and West is only another term, an easier term for the term the space of Jewish folklore. In fact, when we come to classify religions and ways of thinking of primeval, pre-literate people and religions, at the moment there is a possibility to prove that the society consists of Homo sapiens, of thinking people, of people who try to answer questions, why, how did it start, and things of this kind. We can divide religions according to these two criteria: place and time. There are religions that are place religions. Most of the mythologies of the primeval people are space religions, place religions, which means the main thing is the place. The mythology is connected with some place where life started. This place is the most sacred place. There is no life for the people without this place. The Jewish religion, although, as we shall see, place is very important and the whole lecture will be devoted to it, still, time is more important than space. Time is more important than the most sacred place. You can be Jewish and move yourself to a non-sacred place, to live as a Jew not in the Holy Land of Israel. You cannot move a Saturday, a Shabbat, into a Thursday. And in fact, when we take the story of creation and we see how the world was created, we don't find any motivation in the first chapter of Genesis why God created the space, why. But when it comes to the fourth day of creation, when the sun and the moon is created, in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verses 14 and on, we read, "And God said, let there be lights in the firmament." We remember that the firmament was created on the second day of the 6 days of creation. "To divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years." This is the only motivation in the story of creation. Space is not so important as reckoning the time. And times in the original Hebrew means also festivals, Moadim, which means that this is the main approach. As I said, if we take the motif index of folk literature by my revered professor, teacher, and rabbi, as we say, Professor Stitt Thompson, we see that the first letter there, it's divided into letters. The first letter A is called mythology. And we see tens of motifs connected with places, connected with creation, of course. Not so motifs connected with time. In fact, the Jews are the only people in whose folklore a place which has been destroyed, and in other cultures it would testify to the failure of the God and would cause the disintegration of the society whose God couldn't defend. It's his temple, his sanctuary. This is different with the Jewish people, and we do not have another example in other cultures. If we take the ancient cultures, very high cultures, the Egyptian one, the Mesopotamian one, the Maya cultures, everywhere, they had wonderful buildings. They were wonderful monuments, a high civilization, the same in Africa and everywhere else. The moment this was destroyed, it was the end of the religion. The people disintegrated, felt a feeling of inferiority, assimilated, accepted the rule of the conqueror, of the stronger gods. Not so with the Jewish people. The Western Wall, for many, many generations called the Wailing Wall, remained the symbol, and was not the symbol of the defeat, because the place is not so important. The spirit behind the place, the meaning of the place, the message of the place can wander, and you can take with you the place in your heart as long as you live in time and remember. And this is another view of looking into this confrontation between time and place. Still, as we said, in Jewish folklore, and not only in folklore, time and space supplement each other. As we said, time was given and motivated from the beginning. Not so the space, the promised land. According to Jewish later tradition, the creation was a creation from some kind of a center in circles. The most important thing was created at the beginning, and then around this cornerstone, around this stone of foundation, different paths were created. The more the part of the world is removed from the stone of creation, from the stone of foundation, Even Hashtiyah in Hebrew, the less sacred it is. Structurally, this motif is similar to the famous motif, American Indian motif, and other motifs of an earth diver. According to many mythologies, some primeval diver dived into the sea, took some stone or some grain, and from this grain the world started to expand. According to the tradition, the most important place is the Holy of the Holiest in the temple. Around it is the temple area. Around it is Jerusalem, the holy city. Around it is the land of Israel, the Holy Land, and so on. But as we said, the revelation of the holiness of the land of Israel is late in the Bible. It started only in the 20th generation with Abraham. And so we read in chapter 12 of Genesis. Now the Lord had said to Abram, "Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house and go unto a land that I will show you." I hinted already to the fact that in other mythologies, the place of birth, the cradle of mankind, is in the sacred place. In many tribes, American Indian tribes, South American tribes, Africa, and so on, the place where you live, this is the place where your forefathers were the first people they were born and where they lived. This is different. And I stressed already this move, the passage which characterizes Jewish traditions. And Abraham too, in order to create a new life, and new folkways, new ways of thinking, had to leave his original place and to move to another place. And then the Bible continues. It's chapter 12, verse 2. "And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing." Even in those times, although they didn't have a globus to see how small, invisible even, the land of Israel is compared with the surrounding countries, even then it was strange to hear a sentence like, "I will make of thee a great nation." So greatness here, as in all other and later sources, is not the geographical space greatness. It's probably something of the spirit, it's something of creativity, not the material space, not the geometrical space. The land is promised and the land is sacred under some kind of a condition. You assemble in a house of study, in a house of prayer, then it's holy. You leave the place, you can sell it, the holiness leaves it. Not like the time. The time is objectively always sacred. And in fact, the most important happening in Jewish history, the revelation on Mount Sinai, was in the desert, in an undefined place. We do not know until this very day where in fact Mount Sinai was. Again, because all these are not so important. We read at the end of the Pentateuch, the end of the most sacred 5 books of the Bible, about the burial place of Moses. He, which means God himself, buried him Moses in a valley in the land of Moab, but no man knoweth of his sepulchre unto this day. It's not important. It's not important that he was buried in Moab, which is not the Holy Land according to the definitions of its borders. Still, as we said, according to all other concepts of holiness and of sacred space, we have this notion that the central place during the creation, in folk fantasy, in wishful thinking, in the attitude of the people, is Jerusalem and the holy place. This centrality, the focus of the Holy Land, is an important feature in Jewish legends and in Jewish viewpoints. This is like the navel of the world. And again, you have many religions where you have somewhere a place which is the center. Sometimes it's some obelisk which is the center of the world. Sometimes it's a round object like the stone, a round stone like the navel of the world. In Jewish tradition, it's mainly spiritual. And this spiritual center lived on and to some part became some part of the Christian tradition. And when we and the Christians talk about celestial Jerusalem, about the upper Jerusalem, the spiritual Jerusalem, this is the spiritual space. In Hebrew we say Yerushalayim Shelemala, the Yerushalayim of above, the spiritual one. And what was not taken over and in specific Jewish aspects is in Christianity, unlike Judaism, is that there is a continuation from the holiness of the Holy Land and its temple, these components which I mentioned as the center of the world, to the synagogue, You cannot compare the relationship of the Jewish synagogues in plural all over the world to the temple. You cannot compare it with the churches compared to some original church, not in architecture, not in ceremonial art. It's quite different. The Holy Ark, where the scrolls of the Torah are standing, is the same as the Holy of the Holies, the place of the temple where the tablets were extant. The terminology of blessing, all the role of the priests. Until this day, the Jewish society keeps the custom of blessing the people, and although all the tribes vanished and we do not know much about the tribes, but we still have the division into priests, the so-called Kohanim, with all the different names like Kagan and Kaganovich and so on. These are the old priests, and they perform still their duties in the synagogue until this very day. And you have the Levites with the name of Levi and so on. And it goes back to the ritual in the temple, because the Levites, they poured water, they helped the priests. And this structure, to remember the time, the past, to remember that it will be renovated, renewed in the future, all this shows that there is a direct connection between the holy space of the Holy Land, which can be transferred into other places if the Spirit is there. Again, impossible to do this with the time. Another way of consecrating space, even temporarily, is making the Jewish home into a holy place. Again, there is a direct line in the Hebrew language, in Hebrew psycholinguistics, in different expressions, from the Holy Land to the Holy Temple, to the synagogue, to the home. By putting a mezuzah on the threshold of the house, on the door, some kind of a symbol, and we shall talk about these symbols in the third lecture, God willing, and by using the home in the right way in time, which means the year cycle and the life cycle and the circumcision at home and the Shabbat at home and some of the festival meals at home, you combine holy space and holy time and create from the home a small temple, a small holy tabernacle. And in fact, in our sources, very often, the synagogue is called Mikdash Me'at, something of the holy temple. In fact, what makes the mezuzah a symbol is not just the letter there or the shape of this amulet-like item, but what's inside, the parchment with the quotations from the Bible, from the book of Moses, where it says, "Hearken, all Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one." And this sentence makes the belief, "Hearken, O Israel," there is some unity. All Israel is regarded in one word, and God is one, the monotheistic approach, the basic outlook of the Jewish people. It's there, and this makes the home into a holy place. Another holy place in Jewish folklore and in Jewish religion is the Jewish cemetery. Again, just as the Jewish home goes back to the past, to the Holy Temple, so the cemetery is somehow connected with the future, with the belief in resurrection. The tombstones, the tomb is just the shape of the tomb, the standing tomb, or the lying tombstone is like the entrance to the temple, with the two pillars, which we shall see is the main motif, the visual motif, connecting the temple with the curtain of the Holy Ark and with the tombstones. And when the resurrection comes, the people from all over the past, from all over the Jewish world, buried in Jewish cemeteries, according to the folk tradition, will move in subterranean caves to the Holy Land, and there the resurrection will take place, which again connects the holy place, or the original one, with the holy places which are temporary places. No wonder that in many legends and many tales and folk songs and all these things, not only in customs, not only in beliefs, which I talked about so far, the land of Israel and the ramifications of this holy space play an important role. In these songs and in the stories, the wishful thinking, the longing to the land of Israel, of the people who do not live there, the different attempts to reach the Holy Land in many times and through supernatural ways, the belief in some false messiahs who come and see dreams and announce that they will bring out the people like Moses in his time to the Holy Land. All these legends stem from the centrality of the Holy Land and of the inner urge, sometimes until obsession, and people jumping into the waters, believing that they will open just as they opened to Moses during the Exodus, and of course drowning in these waters. And we have many, many historical documents and eyewitnesses that saw all these things. But of course, this feeling for redemption, which is connected with the holy space, plays an important role in Jewish audio oral folklore. The first story collected from Ethiopian Jews over some 30 years ago, it was published for the first time in 1959, tells about their false Messiah. In 1862 it happened. Afterwards we found out, according to documents, the people who told the story just told it as something that happened a long time ago. But then we corroborated it in documents, in historical documents. And a man came and said he had a dream, and two men had the same dream and corroborated and looked at him as on their leader, and he said he will bring out the people of Ethiopia to the promised land. And they moved to the south, and they reached the sea, and there were, according to the tradition, tens of thousands of them, according to some source, to some oral tradition, 600,000, which is the number of the Hebrews who left Egypt, a formulistic number as far as Ethiopia is concerned. Of all these people, only a few returned. All of them passed away. It's a tragic story. Many of them were caught by the Muslims and by the Christians and sanctified God's name and died for their religion. But the story is connected with the holy space. In all Jewish homes and all Jewish synagogues, you have a specimen of folk art called Mizrach, which means, translated verbally, the East. If you take most of the Jewish congregations all over the world, today, and even 100 years ago, the land of Israel, the Holy Land, Jerusalem, was not to the east. It was south of Poland or Germany or Russia. It was west of Iraq and Iran and Yemen. But the first people who left the land of Israel and went to the west, went to Egypt or brought as slaves to Rome, for them, the land of Israel, this holy space was the east, and they built their synagogues looking to the east, and they faced the east when they prayed, because this is the holy space. And this indication, this visual indication, very often made into a paper cutting nowadays. This is put on the eastern wall and symbolizes the holy place. But at the same time, when you ask the people what this word Mizrach means, the east is in a different direction. Israel is in a different direction. It's not the east. Then they will explain this word in 4 letters as an acronym, which is very important in Jewish folk tradition. And the 4 letters of Mizrach mean Mitzad Ze Ruach Chaim, which means from this side is the spirit of life. Again, the same tendency to change the actual, the realistic geographic position of a place, the east, into something spiritual, the spirit of life, which means creativity, which means all the positive values life stands for. The Western Wall is some remnant of this sacred place, and no wonder that today It plays a very important role in the revival of many folk customs, of time customs like the bar mitzvah, which take place there, and so on. In fact, the Americanization, and not only the Americanization of Jewish folk customs, finds its expression also in this approach to the east, to the Mizrach. We know now that in many homes in Soviet Russia, they have a wall in their home, and this wall, which they call the Eastern Wall, and the same thing you have symbolically here in many places, in centers, and so on. You have there pictures of family from Israel, photos taken while in Israel. In Soviet Russia, you have clippings of Hebrew papers which reach them in God knows what way, and they have it there because this reminds you of this spirit of life. These places which I mentioned are the so-called places of action in legends and folk tales, that they take place there. And we call these places in poetics and ethnopoetry and folk literature, locus actionis, the place of action. But not only these places, which appear in many legends, in stories how the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, wanted to reach Israel, how he tried to reach Israel and how he reached Turkey and was unsuccessful. The unsuccessful attempt, and sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's unsuccessful. All these stories focus around the land of Israel, but you have other places which are very important in Jewish folklore. If you ask somebody who is rooted in Yiddish folk songs, in Yiddish lullabies, to name or to quote two lullabies, one of them will be the famous lullaby which starts, "Once upon a time there was a king." And I'm going to start by singing it in the original, and then I shall translate this lullaby, and then you will see what I mean. It starts like this. Amol is given a Melech, der Melech hat gehat a Malke, die Malke hat gehat a Weingarten, in Weingarten is given a Beimele, Lulinke mein Kindele, which means there once was a king, the king had a queen, the queen had a vineyard, in the vineyard there grew a tree, Lululu the refrain, and then the story goes on, and now we are not interested in analyzing this interesting lullaby. What I want to say is that cumulative lullabies of this kind, starting with a king or a tsar in Russia, and there was a tree, and in the tree there was a bird, and the bird had a feather, and so on and so on. This is an international genre. The main difference between the Jewish version and the non-Jewish versions of White Russia and Ukraine is the change of the woods into the vineyard, a Weingarten, the vineyard. Where did the Jews of Poland or of northern Russia who sang this song see vineyards? And who saw a tree, a big tree with nests later in the song and so on, growing in the vineyards? And the same is true in folk tales of other Jewish ethnic groups, where the locus actionis in a parallel Arabic story has the murder or the meeting of the girl and the boy taking place in the desert or close to the well. The Jewish version has them meet in the vineyard, in the kerem. But again, This is the locus actionis in Jewish folktales because in Isaiah, in the Bible, in Isaiah the 5th chapter, it starts, "Now will I sing to my well-beloved a song of my beloved touching his vineyard. My well-beloved had a vineyard in a very fruitful hill, and he fenced it, and gathered out the stones thereof, and planted it with the choicest vine, and built a tower in the midst of it, and also made a winepress therein, and he looked that it should bring forth grapes, and it brought forth wild grapes. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem, and men of Judah," continues Isaiah the prophet, "judge, I pray you, betwixt me and my vineyard. What could have been done more to my vineyard that I have not done it?" And all in Jewish proverbs, in all the Jewish languages, when you describe a disappointment, a slap in your face, and you feel yourself not guilty, you say, "What did I do wrong to my vineyard?" It became an idiom. It became a part of the thinking. So no wonder that this vineyard, which afterwards Isaiah says in verse 7, "For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel." In any case, this is the locus actionis. And not only because of Isaiah. One of the most important books of the Bible, playing a very important role in Jewish folklore, because you read it every Shabbat. You study it in the cheder, Friday morning, you read it in the afternoon, is the Song of Songs. It's a love song regarded by Jewish tradition as an allegorical song between God, who is masculine, and Shabbat, the princess, the wife, and there is some kind of a union, and the Friday night is in Jewish tradition the night of love, of sexual intercourse, of love, Friday night, and all this with the two candles facing each other, with the two chalot facing each other, with all the prayers which start, "Come, you beloved," and so on. All this creates this union, the cosmic union and the family union and the union between God and the people, which is the same. And in this Song of Solomon, in the first chapter we read, when the lover sings to his or her beloved, "My beloved is unto me as a cluster of camphire in the vineyards of En-Gedi." En-Gedi is an oasis in the desert. When you are in En-Gedi, and there were vineyards there, they are like vineyards looking on the sea of death, on the Dead Sea, which is dead, and on the desert, which is dead. And therefore, this allegorical image is very important. And the vineyard gets a specific meaning when you see the geography of the desert and of the area. Or in the same Song of Songs, in chapter 3, "The fig tree puts forth her green figs, and the vineyard with the tender grape give a good smell. Arise, my love, my fair one, and come away." Two verses afterwards, the lover refers to some persons, probably envious ones, who want to destroy the love. And how does he define them? In verse 15 of that chapter 3, he says, "The little foxes that spoil the vineyard." The vineyard is a symbol, a very positive symbol. And these little foxes, or it should be the jackals, because the jackals, they are what we translate today foxes. They spoil the vineyard, they eat the grapes, and they don't let others enjoy it, and so on. So all these, the richness of the images sometimes make these places which are generally not especially sacred, not especially Jewish. They make them into Jewish space, and this is evident in folk tales and in stories. So far, we dealt with the places, the holy places. But as we know, the Jewish geography, Jewish life is not only in the Holy Land. Since the beginning, since Abraham, who probably left behind his family, and when he wanted his children or his son to be married into his family, he had to send his servant far away to his family, which lived not in the holy promised land. And this is true throughout the Jewish history. You had the diaspora in Greece and in Egypt and in Babylonia, and in some instances the creativity of the non-sacred, non-promised land, like Babylonia, was more important than the creativity of the Holy Land. Until this day, until this very day, the Babylonian Talmud is more important for the Jewish decision-making as far as the Jewish law is concerned than the Palestinian Talmud, so-called Jerusalemite Talmud. And therefore, we really cannot talk and we cannot conclude a talk about Jewish space without talking about Jewish ethnic groups. Because in fact, the Jewish ethnicity is connected a lot with the places where the culture of these ethnic groups grew. We know that the Jewish ethnic groups lived and still live in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, and if they are on other continents, in Americas, in Australia, and so they came from these places. If we talk about the Jewish world 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and when we collect authentic folklore and we ask for life histories and for oral history, we cannot go more than 3 or maximum 4 generations, which means to the end of the previous century. And because this gives us an authentic, true picture of the people. And the question is how to divide the Jewish people as far as their culture is concerned. We try to propose a model which is different from the usual classification, which is geographic, or you say European Jews, African, Asian Jews, and so on. Sometimes you say, according to the religion, you say Jews from Christian countries, Jews from Muslim countries, and so. But the folklorists for whom this oral transmission is so important, here orally transmitted, there audio oral, for them the most important criterion of classification of the Jewish tribes, the so-called Jewish tribes, or today they say Jewish ethnic groups, is according to the spoken vernacular, to the languages. Accordingly, we have 4 main groups of Jews. And I'm again trying to work out some kind of a model. One is the Ashkenazi Jews, and their original vernacular, which can go back to the 3rd generation before us, to our grandfathers, or the generation before their grandfathers. This was the folk language, and we shall return to it in the 3rd lecture when we talk about audio-oral symbols. This is the European Jewry, East European, Middle European Jewry. The language itself is called Yiddish, which stems from medieval German. The second group is the Sephardi group, which goes back to the Mediterranean, where too the Jews of Spain were dispersed in the 15th century and the 16th century after the expulsion from Spain, and this is the Mediterranean, and the language is today called Judesmo or Ladino or Judeo-Espanol. This is the language with a strong Spanish component, just like Yiddish has a lot of German components. The third kind is the Jewish Arabic dialects. Jewish Arabic, which means Jews who lived in Arab countries and spoke in their languages, a little bit different from the surrounding Arabic, and with Hebrew expressions, with biblical expressions into the Arabic, and four, Jewish Persian. Which means already, as you see, that it's a mistake to say Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews, because, or Ashkenazi and Oriental Jews, because the scientific denotation is according to the languages, and not all these non-Ashkenazi groups are Sephardi. Sephardi means coming from Spain. Sepharad means Spain. The Jewish Arabic, many of the people who speak Arabic lived in Babylonia and Iraq before the destruction of the Second Temple, and the same may be true with the Yemen and so on. They never passed through Spain. And this is one thing that we should remember, and we should remember that Persian is much closer to Yiddish and much closer to Spanish than to Arabic. It's a Indo-European language, going back to the Sanskrit and so on. It has only a script different, and therefore we must understand that culturally people from Bukhara and from Middle Asia and from Afghanistan and from Iran are quite different from people who were raised in Morocco or Libya or Tunisia or Yemen or Iraq who speak Arabic. Besides these four groups, we have minor groups who speak other languages. I mentioned the Ethiopian Jews, and they speak three different languages which do not belong to this model. The Jews of India, of Cochin, speak Malayalam. Again, always they write their language in Hebrew letters, and this makes a language Jewish, and they include, especially for religious terms, Hebrew words. If we go and look in general on these new immigrants to Israel, and when we started to collect their folklore, it fascinated all the people who dealt with it, because we discovered great riches and great treasures unknown so far. These ethnic groups didn't have written literature. It's par excellence a culture which is based, as we said, on oral tradition, only on oral tradition. In the definition I mentioned mainly oral tradition as main for the general Jewish tradition, but with these tribes of Israel who mainly came to the land of Israel after the establishment of the state, this was the only tradition, the oral tradition, and we didn't know much about it, and only thanks to the collecting and to the voluntary work done by many, many segments in Israel who are interested in the future, in the cultural future of the country, in some kind of a mosaic culture, a pluralistic culture. As far as the different folk traditions are concerned, it helped us to establish these things. I would like to finish this lecture by showing maybe something which is connected with Jewish space. One of the greatest Yiddish writers of the 20s, end of the 30s, was a man called Moshe Kulbak. Born in Vilna, he was an ardent communist, and around 39-40, he was executed in Soviet Russia because of deviations, although he was always fighting the Jewish tradition and Jewish religion and wrote a lot and, in Yiddish. In 1952, most of the leading Jewish poets, on the 12th of August 52, most of the Yiddish writers and poets were executed by a firing squad in a prison in Soviet Russia in the Stalinist era. But he was executed when the purges started before the outbreak of the German-Russian war, and the German-Russian war stopped it, and then it continued. We do not know why he was executed. We do not have the acts of the NKWD and so on. We do not know. There are many speculations what happened. They tried to hush it up, the purges of that time, because the war, after the war against the Nazis, couldn't, at that time, things like this couldn't pass. But some people say that they accused him, they found sins in his writings. One has to remember that as long as a Jewish writer, even who is against the folk tradition, but he writes in Yiddish, and this is what he did, he somehow identifies himself with a very important component of his past, even if he denies and negates other aspects. I want to show the place of space in this poem, because of this space, probably he sanctified God's name. And who knows whether the last sentence before his death was not that sentence which I mentioned today, O hearken, O Israel. I write the English translation. It's a literal translation. It has 5 strophes, and I am analyzing strophe after strophe. I chase it's called the kid, the little goat. I chase the kid into the pasture to graze at ease, the white kid that I bought for 2 silver coins, Somebody doesn't know the meaning of this. He will think a kid costs 2 silver coins, he paid for it. If somebody is rooted in the Jewish tradition, he knows that this is part of the song of the kid, which is a symbol, as we shall see in the 3rd lecture, and it goes back to the Seder, to the very important festival of the Jewish Passover, which is the feast of freedom, of Exodus, and so on. But the kid wanders off through the meadows, and I follow. Through old forests, through vacant fields, we stray the entire week. And on Friday, at noon, the kid halts of a sudden, and I see. Now, it stops on Friday. It can be that it's a regular day. But for a near and for a tradition he was raised on and he is rooted in, Friday is the eve of the holy time of the Shabbat. And then it stops. And then I see a land far away, outspread in blue light, Of course, it can be the blue land of the heart, the blue hope, and so on. But those people who executed him knew very well what this blue land was.